Okay, so I've been studying the play in spectacles for about 30 years and I've been teaching it for about 15 years. And in this video, what I'm going to try and do is give you some really clear information about Arthur Birling. There's another video of mine where I'll give you 60 seconds of quotations on him, and if you're just after a few basic quotations, that's the one to go for. This one, I'm going to give you it in kind of two stages. First off, I'm going to give you an overall description of the main things that you need to know about Arthur Birling as a character. But then I'm also going to get into a little bit more depth and a bit more detail. If you're aiming for the very highest grades in your essays, you're going to need to know some of this more complex information and some of the contextual information around J.B. Priestley and why he created the character in the way that he created him. So let's start with the basic stuff about Arthur, right? The essentials that you need to know is Arthur Birling is a selfish businessman who cares much more about profits than he does about people. He also only really cares about outward appearance, and he never really takes the time to consider what his actions are or how he should be acting in a way that might be different to what he's done before. If we go through the kind of key quotations that we've got in the play, he's described at the start, or he describes himself as a hard-headed, practical man of business, and that's who he is. He is a representation of businessmen, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But he's also shown very early on in the play to be an idiot. He says he's visited the Titanic and that it's unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, and the audience watching at the time in 1945 would have known obviously that the Titanic sank, right? So they already see him as being an idiot. And when he starts to get into questioning with the inspector, even when he gets sort of slightly rattled by the inspector, his main solution to that is not to reflect on his own behaviour or not to change the behaviour of his family. He says, I'd give thousands, yes, thousands to fix the problem, right? Just before the inspector leaves. And with that, we see from him that he thinks money can still fix this problem. And he thinks the position that he's got and the money that he's got can fix anything, right? By the time we get to the end of the play, and most of the characters have had some sort of been affected in some sort of way, Arthur and his wife Sybil are showing that they have made no difference to their lives at all, right? And when he finds out the inspector might not be all that he says, Arthur says, but the whole thing's different now because there's no public scandal going on. As long as nobody in public knows what's going on, as long as he's not affected by it because of the general public knowing about it, then he's fine with anything that he might have done. Okay, so that's your basics on Arthur Birling, right? And it shows you that he doesn't really change throughout the play. He's kind of slightly rattled by the inspector in the middle. But now I'm going to get into a little bit more depth and detail if you want to be getting higher level marks on your essays. Okay, so we need to talk about context for this one, and there are two different eras that we need to know in terms of context for any spectacles. First off, 1912 in the UK, because that's when the play is set, and then the middle of the 1940s, 1945, 1946, because that one was when the play was first put on and when J.B. Priestley is writing it. So if we talk about 1912 to start off with, there's a very rigid class structure in the UK at the time, and in England specifically. Okay, and that's based on kind of very entrenched ideas about class and upper class, middle class, working class, but it's also based on what's happened in the previous sort of 100 years, where we've had the Industrial Revolution in the UK and massive sort of expansion of business people and the business class, and a lot of kind of social climbing within that, right? So Arthur is a representative of that, right? He's a representative of capitalist business people. He's a representative of the establishment. Okay, and in that representative, as being a representative of the establishment, he's about to have a knighthood. He's been the mayor in the town that he's in. He is part of that established class, and also like the growing business class that's going on, right? So that's 1912. By the time we've got to 1945, and the 1946, and the audiences in the UK are starting to see this play for the first time, they've been through two world wars, First World War and Second World War, and they had made a massive difference on that class structure, started to break it down a little bit, right? Particularly for Priestley, he had experiences in the First World War as a private soldier, where he looked at the upper class officers and found them particularly wanting and was very frustrated by them. I'm going to read you a little quote from him about the officer class. He says, "The British command specialised in throwing men away for nothing. The tradition of an officer class, defying both imagination and common sense, killed most of my friends as surely as if those cavalry generals had come out of their chateau with polo manners and beaten their brains out." Call this class prejudice if you like, so long as you remember that I went into that war without any such prejudice, free of any class feeling. No doubt I came out of it with a chip on my shoulder, a big heavy chip, probably some friend's thigh bone. So he saw the officer classes, he saw it running the war particularly badly, right? And a lot of his friends died as a result, as far as he was concerned. And he felt that even though there were a lot of changes after the First and Second World War to the class structure, he still felt that it hadn't gone far enough. During the Second World War, he was on the radio on a regular basis, J.B. Priestley, and the indications that we got from that were that he wanted a more left-wing politics, a politics that was trying to get rid of some of that established order. And in fact, in 1945, 1946, just after the Second World War, there is an election which has a Labour landslide, and a left-wing government comes in the UK. Okay, they'd expected Winston Churchill, who was running the Conservative Party during the war, to win because he'd won the Second World War. But actually the appetite in the country at the time was that, right, we've had a collective effort that goes towards doing something together to win the Second World War. We could have a collective effort to do anything we wanted. So we could have a collective effort to set up the NHS and make sure people have healthcare. We could have a collective effort to make sure that if people are sick and they can't work, we look after them. And this play is to do with that, right? Arthur, in it, as we talked about, is a representative of all those established things. And as we know, as we can see from Priestley's opinion, he is a bit of an idiot, right? Throughout, but particularly shown to be that at the start. Now, if you're ever writing essays about Arthur, that's what you want to talk about. J.B. Priestley created this character to do these things, right? It's not like Arthur is a real person. He's made him a particular type of person, right? He's made him very selfish and very cruel, right? And a sort of laughable figure to make people think people in his position are like that. That's the reason he's been created. So if we kind of go through just some bits and pieces on what he does throughout the play, like we say at the start, those quotations show you that he is a little bit of an idiot. When he's initially with the inspector, and the inspector is asking you about Eva and Arthur having fired her for starting a strike to argue for higher wages, he tries to intimidate the inspector out of this line of questioning, right? So he mentions that I know your boss, I know Colonel Roberts, who's the chief of police, and he says, perhaps I had to warn you that he's an old friend of mine. We play golf together. And this idea that they play golf together is a sort of establishment sports golf, right? Where these rich people are playing golf together and socializing and working out what they're going to do to stay in power. Okay, he's trying to bully and impose himself on the inspector. The inspector obviously has none of this and drives straight through that line of questioning. And as we find out more and more about the different characters and how they were involved in Eva's life, Arthur gets increasingly exasperated as he is unable to use the usual influence that he does and intimidate people as he usually does with the inspector. In fact, it's quite desperate when he offers him the money sort of later on. And we get a lot of sort of pleading from him later on. He's particularly concerned, obviously, about the public-facing aspect of people finding out about how the Birling family were involved with Eva. He says stuff like, I've got to cover this up as soon as I can, and things like that. And he's always talking about the cover-up. He's going to sort of manipulate things. But it's increasingly obvious that he's slightly desperate and he's not going to have the influence to do that, and the influence that he used to have. When we find out that the inspector's not all that he is, obviously Arthur thinks everything is absolutely fine. But what that represents from Priestley is that this character and what he represents in actual society can't change. It's only the younger generation, people of Priestley's generation, who is Eric and Sheila, who are actually affected by it and might actually be able to change things for good. And that is what Priestley is hoping is going to happen in the mid-1940s.